Aloha, I'm Mililani Trask. I'm Kanaka Maoli, a native Hawaiian. I was the first permanent forum Indigenous diplomat from the Pacific Basin to sit on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'm sending this intervention in behalf of Nakua Ikaika Kalahui Hawaii, an Indigenous NGO of Hawaiians who is affiliated to the Indigenous World Association under their ECOSOC credential. This intervention is being sent because we and the vast majority of Indigenous peoples of the world are not able to join you for your important deliberations in St. Petersburg, Russia. But the Indigenous peoples are sending this intervention because we need your help for critical human rights issues relating to UNESCO and the World Heritage Convention. For many years, Indigenous peoples globally have been trying to make a positive impact on the way that the UNESCO World Heritage Committee addresses the taking of land and natural resources belonging to Indigenous peoples. Significant problems and human rights violations have occurred. Examples of this are the taking of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, what is now known as the Papahanaumoku Monument. This took 140,000 nautical miles out of Indigenous Kanaka Maoli trusts. Similar problems have occurred with the Ngorongoro Conservation District in Tanzania, the Western Ghats in India, the Tri-National de la Sangha in the Congo and in Cameroon, and elsewhere, where the lands and resources, critical resources from Indigenous peoples, are being nominated and listed without their free, prior, and informed consent in violations of the provisions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is for this reason that we're sending to you, the delegations of NGOs, this urgent request for assistance. The right of self-determination guarantees to all Indigenous peoples and nations their human right to participate meaningfully whenever their lands and resources are impacted by state and NGO undertakings. These primary human rights have been violated because the UNESCO World Heritage Convention system has yet to adopt the United Nations Declaration or to begin to implement its provisions and the UNDP guidelines. For many years, Indigenous peoples have worked collectively and globally to put together a strategy to address these expanding human rights violations. It would be a critical error if, in the absence of Indigenous nations and peoples at the St. Petersburg Forum, that the NGOs there would choose to divert from the global strategy of Indigenous peoples. This strategy is contained in two joint statements that have been filed over the past recent years with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Indigenous nations from all regions have worked with others to create this strategy. These joint statements and collective submissions are at the St. Petersburg NGO gathering. They have been brought there by our representative, Mr. Stephen Desko, and also NGO Evgia from Copenhagen, Denmark. We're asking that the NGOs gathered in St. Petersburg do not create a new strategy to address these problems, but instead acknowledge and respect the joint statements that Indigenous peoples are sending. We are requesting that the final report that issue from the NGO Forum contain one small paragraph that acknowledges the joint statements filed with the UN Permanent Forum and that supports and acknowledges the recommendations contained therein. We do not believe that the NGOs in St. Petersburg can usurp the right of Indigenous peoples to exercise their right of self-determination, to represent, to participate in this most important gathering. This is why we are asking you to demonstrate your support by coming forward. We do not need a lengthy document. We need only a small statement that acknowledges the unity of Indigenous peoples in proposing the strategy to the United Nations Permanent Forum. If the NGOs in St. Petersburg can acknowledge these joint statements and can support the recommendations contained therein, we can move forward collectively and in a positive way to address the ongoing and serious human rights violations being perpetrated by the UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee. In closing, let me thank the NGOs who have facilitated this, our indigenous partners from Russia, Mr. Stephen Demke, and also especially the FGIA and Mr. Stefan Disco. Delegates wishing to learn more about this, those who are drafting language for the outcome documents, please find the FGIA representative and Mr. Stefan Disco. Aloha and God bless your deliberations.